I wanted to share a couple of minutes, some good information if you ever have a starting issue with a motorcycle, especially an old bike. In this case, 26, 27-year-old bike. Now this video has a lot of little funny things, but it's really informative. I want to start at the beginning. A year ago, my R1 had the starter lock up solid. Glenn came and rescued me, and it took me 4 days to get the starter replaced. So the way this little adventure started is the battery on the bike was getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And eventually, of course, I wanted to get ready for the riding season. I bought a brand new lithium ion battery tender. Put the battery tender in the bike, and the bike wouldn't start. Now, there's a lot of things about working on motorcycles. Fixing dents, painting, mechanical things, replacing chains, adjusting valves, all the things I feel very comfortable doing. And changing tires, of course, mundane things. But when it comes to anything electric, I'm really at a disadvantage because I hate electric. I'm a bigot. I always wish all bikes came with a kickstarter. I would rather have a kickstart bike. I would pay extra to have kickstart instead of electric start. Basically because I'm old and feeble. But anyway, this is a funny story. Number one on the A-team, this is pretty funny. I put out a call to my A-team, and I said if anybody has a spare battery, I could just switch the battery and see maybe I got a bad battery from battery tender. Well, somebody dropped this battery off in my garage. Never signed who sent it. I assume it's Turbo Steve, Mark, Glenn. I don't even know who sent it, but I was afraid to touch it. It's such a pretty battery. But anyway, Luciano was coming over to do some other things. We're doing dent removal on tanks. So he offered to help me for the day. Now, Luciano is real good at diagnosing electrical stuff. So we did all the usual testing stuff. And because here's the whole thing in a nutshell, I do have a spare bike. I have the exact evil twin to this bike. I thought, how bad can this be? So we started with replacing parts. Of course, first that's an easy part that didn't do anything. Replaced the starter. Took 5 minutes to take the starter out. Luckily, the starter on this bike you can take in and out quicker than you can order a pizza. Not on an R1, no. Forget on an R1. Now, luckily, the whole thing, the Kawasaki manual, totally details out how to diagnose the problem. But it's a lot easier if you have two guys. And if one of them has some clue as to what he's doing. So how funny is this? Luciano brought an extra battery. We replaced the battery, and this is really not funny. And bike didn't start. Took the handlebar switch off the bike, cleaned all the connections. Bike didn't start. Split all the multi-connectors, cleaned all the pins. Bike didn't start. This is the funny part that you can't make up. Can't make this up any way possible, but Luciano is my witness. This is true. We both thought, well, maybe the starter motor is so easy to take out. 2 bolts, starter motor comes out. Let's just take the starter motor out and bench test it. We took the starter motor out and it was dead. Totally dead. Wouldn't turn over at all. So, took the starter motor out of the spare bike. That's hooked up the jumper cables to that motor. Beautiful. It ran great. So I put the starter motor in from the other bike. So now, as funny as this is, the original starter motor that didn't turn over at all, would not turn at all. Once we swapped it, I said, well, let's see if the old one, the one that didn't work at all, worked. And we hooked the jumper cables to it, it worked fine. So if you're following this, it's like the Perot mystery. It's like, how the hell can you make this stuff up? So during the whole course of doing this, and I looked at Luciano, he looked at me, and there's this little switch on the handlebar. It's the lockout switch for the clutch. That I have buckets and buckets of spare parts for this bike, but I did not have a spare switch, and I forgot why. And then I remembered about 2 years ago, I replaced that switch with the switch from the donor bike. That's why the donor bike didn't have a switch on it. So now that switch, and they're both 27 years old. That switch is corroded and rotted and needs to be rebuilt, or just going to get another switch. But the test was, we just jumped, in other words, we eliminated the switch, we jumped the circuit, and the bike started right up. But now, if you know that ahead of time, if you do what Kawasaki suggests and you diagnose these things one step at a time, yeah, it works great. Having a friend like Luciano that'll come over and spend a day with you, you know, well, I got it apart, I'll clean this all up and may even put a new set of plugs in it, get ready for the summer. But anyway, the whole thing was, and this was my point for making a video and sharing it, that when it's this kind of a Mickey Mouse thing, it's always good to think, well, what's the last thing I replaced? Well, it wasn't the battery at all. So, but then, having my logbook, when I looked in the logbook and I said, oh yeah, 2 years ago I replaced that switch, it went bad. I replaced it with another 27-year-old switch. Now it went bad. It's that switch that went bad. So what I'm going to do, and obviously this is a simple repair job now, I can order a new switch from Kawasaki that's still available. And in the meantime, I'm just going to let the wires be jumped so I can ride the bike this week, because we are coming up on the good old riding season. But interesting stuff. But here's the point I'm making. Anything electric, to me, is a real pain in the neck. I really don't like working with electric. I know Vince does, Luciano does, maybe some other people, but I would rather work on paint, Bondo, mechanical stuff, battery acid, but not electricity. And what I always suggest to people, and it's such a basic thing, if you have an antique bike that's already 25 or more years older, and you can find another bike, that even one that doesn't have a title or wheels or a motor or whatever, just having it, you get it real cheap, stick it somewhere under a tarp. Today, it proved its worth. We were able to swap parts and eliminate, get it down to where it was the switch, and now at least we have the bike back to running. Now another thing, whenever I have the bike apart like this, I always try to clean the parts up and put everything back together a little bit neater than it was. They always have mud up under the tank and dead bugs and whatever. And so anyway, that was our adventure today, and I think it was a fun adventure. I always enjoy hanging out. I always enjoy doing these things that at the end of the day, you hit the button or you go for a ride. Not going to ride today, but always good to share. I like to share the information, and I was really befuddled in the beginning because I didn't really know which part to swap first. Luciano went through this pretty quickly, diagnosed it, and we have the parts. And even if we didn't, I just have to order them from Partzilla. And now all that's left is to put the bike back together. Now, just to show you how useful, and this is a really useful tip, whenever I have this kind of an issue, and I probably have said this a million times before, every step of the way I'll turn the key on and just see that I haven't disturbed anything up here. Now, it's funny that this happened. When I put this together the first time, anybody that's ever taken one of these off on a Kawasaki knows there's a little spring in there and a little cup of copper, and you have to get the copper, the spring, and a little button all pushed in at the same time. Can be tricky, especially if you're an old geezer like me. So what I found out, among other things, is I took the little cup and soldered, put 1 drop of solder on the spring to it so that it goes in as a unit, and then that button, I can just press that button. I checked it every step of the way because I didn't want to get to this point. It's such a pain in the ass putting this piece in with the 2 cables and everything. Get to that point, you hit the button and something's wrong. So and Luciano's right about this. Every time you tighten a bolt or we do something else, every time, turn the key, make sure everything's working. And then at least if you know, because the problem is if you put the whole bike back together and then you hit the button and nothing happens, you don't know where it went wrong. So that is the best tip of the day, and that's really the only reason I made this video. That is something worth sharing. Boy, there's nothing more rewarding than when you have one of these repairs done and it works out as good as this did. Thank you, Luciano. We are ready for a test ride, but unfortunately, or fortunately, as I say it, The baby arrives. No test ride today. Mrs. Ertnowski arrives. Put the toys away. So our test ride is going to have to wait for another day. But hey, hope you enjoyed the video, picked up a couple of tips.